So let's get started. This is Dr. Sara Gottfried. Many of you know me. We've been doing this cleanse now for a couple of weeks. The intention is for our cleanse today. Our intention for today is to really focus on how cleansing alters both your brain and your hormones. And I saved this for 2 weeks in because it's a lot of information. And for many people, it's completely overwhelming if you do it without experiencing what the cleanse is like and some of the feelings when you're on these uh, cortisol adjusting smoothies. You need to be on it to really understand some of the changes that are happening, some of the physiologic changes. So, our focus today is session 3, how cleansing alters your brain and hormones. Go to the first slide. And this is an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. It's kind of a complicated graph, but the idea here is that you have stress on the y-axis, cortisol on the x-axis, adrenal function, which changes as stress and cortisol increase and then can plummet at some point. That level of plummet changes individual to individual. But at some point, our adrenals just can't keep up anymore, and you have this crash, which I call adrenal fatigue. And this affects many different systems, including not just your adrenal glands, but your sex hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. It affects your thyroid, particularly at the higher levels of stress and higher levels of cortisol. And nutrition is this big green backdrop for this whole story. And that's where we're working with the cleanse to ameliorate some of these changes that happen with increased stress and increased cortisol. And then insulin is a big part of the story, especially early on with cortisol levels. We're going to be spending a fair amount of time talking about insulin today and how it's at the root of difficulty with weight loss and many of the degenerative diseases that women develop. Now, before launching into the data, I want to just remind you once more that I want you to really focus on this talk while we're together, that changes rarely are transformative unless you give them your undivided attention. So I really invite you to put away any busy work or multitasking that you're trying to do, and as much as possible, stay with the presentation. Okay, so go for the A+ on the intention and the focus. This is a quote from a Hindu scholar named Swami Adiswarananda. He says, "We must renounce what we've been doing for something that feels better. None of us renounces what feels good for something that feels worse." And the idea is you have to feel better before you can make some of these transformative changes that we're talking about today. So many of you are experiencing some of those changes already. You feel better, you feel more clear. Sometimes you feel more clear, then less clear, and then more clear again. One of you mentioned that. And the focus is really on present valuing as much as possible the positive changes that you feel as a result of this cleanse. So I want you to really focus on that. And that's also a journal assignment, a homework assignment for you to really be documenting some of the positive changes that you're feeling as you go through this cleanse. Because the more that we can calibrate to you and what you're known for, the more you're going to accelerate change. So why bother talking about insulin? I'm going to start off with insulin resistance. And I just want to hit this point of, why should we bother talking about it? And I want to make this point that balance between insulin and glucose is arguably the single most important clinical issue facing the practicing clinician today. So I'm saying that from a doctor's perspective, that this is so crucial to helping women, people generally, reduce chronic disease, but it's also, I would say, the most important problem that the general population is facing. So I want to talk about that more specifically. And if you're wondering what I mean by that, insulin resistance is causal in so many of the conditions that we face: prediabetes, diabetes, dementia, Alzheimer's, stroke, heart disease, polycystic ovarian syndrome. You may know someone who has PCO, certain cancers, overweight, and obesity. So which cancers are we talking about? Breast cancer is a big one. Many other reproductive cancers that women have, such as endometrial cancer, also is linked to insulin resistance. So a quick overview on where we're going to be going. What does cleansing help with? And I have so much data for you today. It's going to be a little bit overwhelming, but just a reminder that we're going to be emailing the PDF of the PowerPoint to you, so you'll have that on hand if you need it. And I've put this information together in a way that I haven't done previously. So if you read my blogs or my e-newsletters, you'll find this information consolidated in a way that maybe you haven't seen before, synthesized in a new way, and I just want you to bear with me as I go through a lot of data. I love to kind of eat data for breakfast, and you're going to get a lot of it today. But here's where we're going. We're going to be talking about insulin resistance, how this cleanse helps with insulin resistance. It's linked to adrenal dysregulation. Adrenal burnout is another word for it, adrenal failure. And then I want to talk about both the early and late adaptation that happens with adrenal dysregulation. So this relates to early and late stress response, and then how this then affects your neurotransmitters. So your hormones are interdependent with your neurotransmitters. The different hormonal systems, such as thyroid, adrenals, sex hormones, all three of those are interdependent, and we'll be talking about those as well. Estrogen dominance, gut health, thyroid function, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. Insulin resistance. So here's a quick definition. Many of you have probably heard the word insulin resistance, and I want to get very specific about what it actually means. So insulin resistance is defined as a condition in which normal amounts of insulin are inadequate to produce a normal insulin response from fat, muscle, and liver cells. So what does insulin do? It basically gets cells to take up glucose. So when your glucose is elevated in your blood because you've just eaten a meal, maybe you just had lunch, insulin rises to drive the glucose into cells so that you can use the glucose as energy. The main job that insulin has is to get cells to take up glucose from the blood. Insulin resistance refers to higher and higher levels of insulin required to get the same result. So many of you have heard about this in different contexts. I put a spectrum here at the bottom of the slide of normal glucose tolerance, normal insulin levels. I'll get to more specifics on how you define that from laboratory values, to a more insulin resistant state, which if it's not reversed, if it's not addressed, can turn into diabetes, type 2 diabetes. So another word for the insulin resistant state is pre-diabetes, but diabetics, full-blown diabetics with a fasting glucose of greater than 125, they also are insulin resistant. What are some signs of insulin resistance? So these are some of the things that people may experience. And before I jump into this, I just want to say that I had insulin resistance. So I totally reversed it. But I had insulin resistance even though I'm lean. I'm 5'5" and I weigh about 125 pounds. Even though I'm lean, I have a fair amount of adrenal dysregulation, and that leads me, because of my high cortisol levels, to have an elevated glucose level and therefore a high insulin level. So I had insulin resistance related to adrenal dysregulation. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But here's some of the signs of insulin resistance. First, increased abdominal fat. So this is the muffin top that we talk about. Erratic or no energy derived from food. So you eat food and it just doesn't feel like it's landing. It doesn't feel like it's doing what it should be doing. Hypoglycemia, hyperglycemia. This is a really important one and is causal for disrupted sleep. So for many of the patients that I take care of, particularly women in their 40s and 50s, they find that as their ovaries start to sputter, or if their ovaries are gone, that they have trouble with abnormal glucoses in the middle of the night, particularly between 1 and 4 a.m. So awakenings that happen between 1 and 4 a.m. are often an alarm system that your body has for your glucose either being too low or too high. This also causes sugar cravings, particularly alcohol cravings. Wine is the most common that I see. Insulin resistance can also be associated with elevated triglycerides and lower HDL, which is the good cholesterol. You don't want that. HDL is probably the most important biomarker for cardiovascular disease for women. And if you drop your HDL, that is not a good thing. Increased blood pressure is another phenomenon that we see with insulin resistance. And then just by way of diagnosis, these are some of the issues that we see. This is how we make the diagnosis. So fasting insulin greater than 7. That's one definition of insulin resistance. Another is a hemoglobin A1C greater than 5.5. And I even like to be more aggressive because I am into radical prevention. I like to see the hemoglobin A1C less than 5. Fasting glucose greater than 99 is also a definition for glucose intolerance, meaning that you have problems. You have glucose that's too elevated for your cells to be functioning properly, and it therefore affects your metabolism. So those are some of the definitions. The classic way of diagnosing insulin resistance, I studied when I was a fellow at Harvard, and the classic way of defining this is to do an insulin clamp test. And that's where you get admitted to the hospital for a couple of days, and they put in certain amounts of glucose and they measure your insulin, and it's an experimental protocol that pretty much no one has. And so these other tests, these 3 tests, are a proxy for that insulin clamp. Okay, so that's what I tend to use in my office, and you'll see other definitions that are a little less aggressive in the literature. But I find that these work well when we're working on prevention and reversal. What about leptin? Leptin is a newer hormone. It was first studied and defined in the literature in 1994. So insulin was found much longer ago. Leptin is sort of a newer cousin to insulin. And the interesting thing is that leptin and insulin sort of share this job of managing both your glucose levels and also your metabolism. Leptin has one other additional job, which is that it's involved in managing your hunger. It's really the hunger switch in the brain. So let me tell you a little bit more about leptin. And I also happen to know that some smaller fonts are coming my way, so I need to put my glasses on. There we go. Okay. So your brain, when your brain can't sense leptin, so when you become insulin resistant, this starts to turn into leptin resistance, and it slows down your metabolism and it makes you store calories as fat. This is especially common in people who traditionally had famines. So I have a fair amount of Irish blood, for instance, and leptin resistance is just all over my family. We're really good at making it through a potato famine because we can store fat for a really long time. So it's got some evolutionary adaptation and benefits, but when you're trying to get rid of your muffin top, it can feel excruciating and very difficult to do. So what happens is that when the pancreas can't sense leptin, it pumps out excess insulin, and then this sets the stage for insulin resistance. So one quick reminder here, insulin is made in the pancreas. It's made by the islet cells of the pancreas. Leptin is made in fat cells. So 2 different origins for these cousin hormones that affect glucose and metabolism. So normal is to have a fasting leptin that is less than 6. That should be a less than 6. Ideal is between 4 and 6. You don't want it to be too low. You don't want it to be too high. And then there's this triad of 3 conditions that tend to lead to fatigue and weight gain. And this is a triad I see all the time in my practice. And that is leptin resistance, so fasting leptin that's greater than 6. Actually, that's the definition, so I guess the way I wrote it is correct. So leptin resistance is a fasting leptin greater than 6. Insulin resistance, which I defined on the previous slide, fasting insulin greater than 7, hemoglobin A1C greater than 5.5, or fasting glucose greater than 99. And adrenal resistance. So we're going to get into adrenal dysregulation in a minute, but that's the phenomenon that I had. I had this whole triad when I first started working on this on myself about 6-7 years ago. So I put a little green sunshine at the top of the slides that show how the cleanse helps you. So you'll see this little, when you get a copy of the slides, you'll see slides that have this little sunshine at the top. And that's where we're really focused on how this cleanse is changing you and changing the condition that we're talking about. So